It began on a night that was quieter than most, when the stars seemed to lean closer, as though they too wished to listen. Morty was small then, almost invisible in the folds of the universe, yet there was something about him that drew attention in a way he never asked for. He did not shine or roar, but he carried within him a strange resonance, like a soft hum no one else could hear. Those around him noticed in fleeting moments the way he lingered when others hurried past, the way he watched clouds move as if they were spelling secrets only he understood. He didn't have words for it, but his heart was already stretching, already learning to hold more than it should. Some said he was a child touched by oddity, marked by something unspoken, but Morty never felt chosen. He felt ordinary, clumsy even, yet inside him lived an unexplainable tenderness, like a lamp that glowed whether or not the night required it. He could sense the quiet aches of those around him, the neighbour whose laugh trembled at the edges, the classmate who hid loneliness behind noise, even Rick, whose brilliance often masked a tired sorrow. Morty didn't speak about it. He simply absorbed, bent, and softened himself to fit near them, as if his spirit had been designed to stretch into the empty spaces of others. And though the world spun strange and unpredictable, Morty carried his days with this small light. In the hush of early mornings, he would sit alone, wondering if anyone else noticed the way silence sometimes seemed to breathe. He had the uncanny feeling that his life was waiting for something unseen, waiting for the moment when all the tenderness he carried would be tested. Yet in those days, it was only a boy with too much feeling, holding on to moments of stillness like treasures hidden under his pillow. And in the shadows of those early hours, a quiet promise began to take shape. One he hadn't spoken aloud, but one the stars, leaning close, surely heard. The mornings of Morty's childhood were filled with a softness that lingered like the aftertaste of a lullaby. He would wake to the sound of distant machinery, the low whir of Rick's strange contraptions hidden in the garage, and though he didn't understand what they were for, he always felt a quiet curiosity tug at him. Sometimes, sitting on the porch with a half-eaten sandwich in his lap, he would watch the sky bend faintly around the house, as if the universe itself warped in response to whatever Rick had set in motion. It frightened him a little, but more than that, it fascinated him. He wondered if other children ever felt their home sit so close to the edge of something vast and unknowable. Yet despite the strangeness, Morty's days were threaded with simple comforts. He would walk barefoot through the grass, toes damp with dew, and lie beneath the fading summer sun, imagining whole stories written in the drifting clouds. Sometimes they looked like faces, sometimes like doorways opening into other worlds. He believed, in that quiet way children believe, that if he stared long enough the clouds would whisper back. He carried this secret faith silently, never telling Summer, who teased him enough already, and never telling Rick, who would have laughed it away. Still, Morty felt the whispers all the same, like gentle music only his heart was tuned to hear. He was not untouched by loneliness. The peculiar weight he carried inside him often made him feel apart, as though he lived one step out of sync with those around him. In school, he stumbled over words, his awkwardness drawing laughter from classmates who never noticed how carefully he watched them, memorizing the flicker of their moods. He understood their hurts even when they spoke cruelly to him, and in some small, unexplainable way he forgave them before they ever asked. This was the quiet rhythm of his days, absorbing, forgiving, holding, stretching himself to make space for others without knowing that was what he was doing. Rick, in his uneven way, saw glimpses of it. Sometimes Morty would catch him watching, eyes shadowed not with judgment, but with something harder to name, something like regret. Rick never said much. He didn't need to. A hand on Morty's shoulder, the briefest pause before dismissing him with a grumble, carried more weight than words could. Morty tucked these rare moments away, as carefully as he kept the cloud whispers and the secret ache of wanting to belong. They became part of him, stitched into the growing fabric of his identity. The seasons moved gently forward, each one layering Morty with quiet lessons. He grew used to the strangeness of Rick's inventions humming in the background of his life, the way time sometimes seemed to bend or stutter in their presence. He accepted it all, though a quiet unease remained. an intuition that these distortions were not just accidents of science, but signposts pointing toward a life that would not stay ordinary. Even then, lying under a sky, trembling faintly with possibility, he sensed that his story was already unfolding toward something larger than himself, though it moved so quietly he almost mistook it for nothing at all. There were evenings when Morty would linger in the backyard long after the air had cooled, lying in the grass with his hands folded under his head, watching the first stars gather. The world felt heavier at night, as if every unspoken thought pressed down with the darkness, yet he found comfort in that weight. The hum of Rick's inventions carried faintly through the walls, blending with the chorus of crickets, and Morty often imagined the two sounds were in conversation, a dialogue between Earth and cosmos. He didn't tell anyone that he felt part of this exchange, as though the stars and the machines alike were waiting for him to answer. Summer would sometimes join him, though she never stayed as long. She teased him for staring too long at nothing, yet on nights when she lingered, she would lie beside him and fall silent, her voice softening until her presence was simply warmth at his side. Morty didn't need her to understand his thoughts. It was enough that she stayed. In those moments he learned something about companionship, that true closeness often required no words at all. The lesson imprinted itself quietly, like dew settling on blades of grass. School grew more complicated as the years passed. His awkwardness never truly left him, and though he tried to fold himself into the rhythm of others, he always felt slightly misaligned, like a note held a fraction too long. Still, he found small ways to adapt. When others laughed at him, he smiled back gently, as if to absorb the sting before it spread. Teachers noted his distracted gaze but missed the truth, that Morty was not absent, only elsewhere, stretching his thoughts into corners of the world they had not considered. What looked like daydreaming was in fact his way of carrying what others could not hold. Rick's shadow loomed larger with each passing season. The old man's experiments grew louder, stranger, their effects bleeding more into daily life, and Morty began to understand that the hum he had grown up with was not background noise, but a pulse of the universe itself, reshaped in Rick's hands. Sometimes Rick would pull Morty into the garage, handing him tools without explanation, expecting him to follow. Morty fumbled, clumsy with the equipment, but Rick rarely grew angry. Instead, there was a sharp impatience in him, softened at the edges when Morty tried again. These nights carved something into Morty, the realization that his grandfather's brilliance was bound with solitude, and that solitude was heavier than any invention could bear. Morty didn't fix machines, he fixed silences, filling them with presence until they hurt a little less. And so, the rhythm of his life wove itself together. Days of awkwardness, nights of stars, moments of unspoken understanding with Summer, fragments of lessons learned from Rick's unfinished sentences. Each piece seemed disconnected on the surface, but Morty carried them like stones in his pocket, sensing that one day they would form a path. He could not name it yet, but he felt the direction tugging at him, a pull as quiet as breath and as certain as dawn. It was not the path of brilliance nor of power, but of something gentler, something that demanded patience. And though he did not know it then, every step he took in this quiet rhythm was already leading him closer to the moment when he would have to decide what kind of person he would become. The days began to layer themselves into a rhythm Morty couldn't quite name, yet he felt it shaping him all the same. The hum of inventions, the teasing warmth of Summer, the long silences between himself and Rick, each moment pressed into him like impressions left in soft clay. He carried them with a kind of unspoken reverence, as though even the smallest details mattered, even the fleeting glances or half-formed sentences. What others might have dismissed as ordinary, Morty held on to, sensing that one day these fragments would mean more than they seemed. He found himself becoming more aware of the spaces between things. When Rick's experiments rattled the garage, Morty noticed the brief stillness afterward, the breath of silence heavy with questions that Rick never answered. When Summer's laughter faded, he caught the way her shoulders sometimes slumped as if carrying her own hidden burdens. Even at school, among the noise and movement of classmates, Morty's attention drifted toward the pauses, the boy who hesitated before joining a game, the girl who smiled too quickly to hide unease. Morty didn't act on these observations directly, not yet, but he stored them quietly in the folds of his heart, as though he were collecting maps to places no one else could see. There was one evening, late and heavy with the smell of rain, when Rick asked him to hold a strange tool steady. Morty's hands trembled under the weight, and for a moment the machine sparked dangerously, light spilling like a burst of captured stars. Rick muttered curses under his breath, snatched the tool away, and continued as if nothing had happened. But Morty noticed something flicker in his grandfather's eyes, something almost like recognition. Not of failure, but of possibility. Rick didn't say it, of course, he never did. Yet Morty felt it, a wordless acknowledgement that he was more than just a fumbling helper. It was the kind of moment that etched itself deep, reshaping how Morty saw himself. After that, he grew more patient with his own clumsiness. The awkwardness that once embarrassed him became something softer, something he could live with. He realized that stretching, whether of hands, spirit, or heart, was not meant to be graceful at first. It was meant to be honest. And in this realization, he began to see his gift more clearly. Not strength, not brilliance, but the ability to bend without breaking, to absorb without losing himself. Nights grew longer, and Morty returned often to the grass beneath the stars. He no longer waited for the clouds to whisper back. Instead, he listened inward to the strange, steady hum he carried in himself. It was not loud nor heroic, but it was constant, and in its constancy he found a kind of peace. He did not know it yet, but this quiet strength, the willingness to stretch, to stay, to feel, was already becoming the promise he would live by. And while the world around him kept shifting, restless and strange, Morty's small vow grew roots, sinking deeper into him with every passing day, preparing him for the moments ahead when that vow would finally be tested. The days moved forward with the slow patience of turning seasons, and Morty felt himself changing in ways he couldn't quite explain. The clumsy boy who once hid his unease behind hesitant smiles was beginning to grow into someone more certain, though the certainty was not loud. It lived quietly inside him, a steady current that deepened with every small choice he made. He had begun to understand that strength was not in avoiding awkwardness or mistakes, but in carrying them with gentleness, refusing to let them harden into bitterness. What he once saw as weakness was slowly becoming his quiet kind of power. Rick noticed it in fragments, though he would never say it aloud. On nights when Morty helped in the garage, fumbling less, focusing more, Rick would pause longer before dismissing him. There was always a muttered complaint to cover it up, but the silence between words spoke differently. Morty caught those silences like fireflies, rare and flickering, and stored them away as proof that even Rick, with all his chaos and brilliance, could see that something within Morty was unfolding. Summer noticed too, though in her own way. Her teasing softened over time, less sharp, more companionable, as though she trusted him to hold her unspoken truths. She would sit beside him in the fading light, no longer asking why he watched the sky so intently, but instead watching with him. She didn't admit it, but Morty could feel it. She leaned on his presence the same way he leaned on hers. Their quiet bond deepened, not through grand confessions, but through the gentle rhythm of shared silence. At school, Morty's awkwardness never fully left him, yet it stopped feeling like a barrier. He had grown accustomed to his role as the one who noticed what others overlooked. When a classmate sat alone, Morty found himself drifting closer. When someone's voice wavered, he spoke softly, steadying it. These moments rarely earned him recognition. Sometimes they weren't even remembered. But Morty didn't need recognition. What mattered was the subtle shift in the air afterward, the quiet relief in someone's shoulders, the almost invisible easing of loneliness. Each act, however small, added another layer to the vow that was slowly taking shape within him. And through it all, the hum remained. It followed him like a pulse beneath every ordinary day, reminding him of something larger, something waiting. At night, lying under the familiar blanket of stars, Morty felt it more strongly. The hum seemed to resonate with the sky itself, as though he were tethered to a rhythm too vast to comprehend. He didn't know what it was preparing him for, but he sensed it with the same certainty he felt when clouds whispered in his childhood. The universe, vast and strange, was waiting for him to step into the fullness of who he was becoming. This quiet promise, this vow without words, was no longer just a hidden part of him. It was shaping him, guiding him toward choices he hadn't yet faced. And though Morty could not yet see the path ahead, every breath, every act of gentleness, every moment of silent strength was carrying him closer to the moment when that path would demand he choose not just who he was, but who he was willing to remain, even when everything around him might urge him to change. The first ripples of challenge arrived so quietly that at first Morty mistook them for nothing more than another of Rick's experiments gone wrong. It was a night heavy with static, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand on end, when Rick pulled him into the garage without explanation. Machines hummed louder than usual, their edges glowing faintly as though touched by lightning, and Morty felt the air tremble with a kind of pressure he couldn't name. He had grown used to strangeness, but this felt different, less like a mishap, more like a threshold. Rick barked instructions, his words clipped, sharp with urgency, and Morty, though stumbling at first, followed them with surprising steadiness. His hands no longer shook the way they once did. His movements, though cautious, carried a quiet assurance. As the machine flared with sparks, Morty saw a flash of something impossible, a glimpse of countless reflections, versions of himself stretched across universes like scattered echoes. They flickered past too quickly to understand, but the image left a weight inside him, as though he had just been reminded of a truth he had always suspected, that somewhere beyond his smallness, he mattered. When the machine finally steadied, Rick exhaled, muttered about faulty wiring, and pushed Morty aside. But Morty wasn't thinking about wires. He was thinking about the faces he had seen, all bearing his own eyes, all carrying different versions of the same quiet ache. The next morning, nothing looked the same. The house, the sky, even summer's familiar teasing carried a new kind of gravity, as if hidden meanings pressed against the edges of ordinary life. Morty began to notice his empathy sharpening, stretching farther. When someone laughed, he sensed the fracture beneath it. When someone sighed, he felt the echo of years behind the sound. It was overwhelming at times, like holding too much light in his hands, but he could not push it away. Instead, he let it in, breathing through the weight, learning to carry it as part of himself. Rick, perhaps noticing, grew more impatient, though not in anger. His muttered complaints were louder, but his silences lingered longer. He began giving Morty tasks he would never have trusted him with before, leaving him alone with delicate instruments, watching from the corner of his eye. Morty understood this for what it was, not trust spoken, but trust lived in action. And though Rick never admitted it, Morty felt the rare warmth in the space between them, fragile but real, a warmth he dared not shatter by naming aloud. Summer, too, saw the shift. She stopped teasing him for staring at clouds, and instead asked what he saw in them. Morty hesitated, unsure how to explain, but she listened anyway, her face soft in the fading light. He realized then that his gift was no longer just his burden, to carry. It was becoming something others leaned into, a quiet refuge in a world that often forgot how to be gentle. And yet, with every step deeper into this unfolding, Morty sensed a shadow waiting at the edges. The memory of the reflections lingered, especially the one face that did not soften, the one version of himself that looked back with a gaze stripped of all tenderness. It haunted him, reminding him that every gift carried its opposite, that the same heart that could stretch to hold others could also be emptied, hardened, left cold. Morty did not speak of it, not even to Summer, but it lived in him as a warning. He knew, though he did not yet know how, that one day he would have to face that shadow. The shadow did not announce itself with thunder or alarm. It arrived in the stillness between ordinary days, settling in like a chill that lingers long after the sun has set. Morty first sensed it when the laughter of others no longer sounded whole, when even moments of warmth seemed edged with a quiet dissonance. It was subtle at first, an unease that brushed against him when he least expected it, like the echo of a voice he couldn't quite hear. Yet he knew, with the certainty of someone listening inward, that this was no passing feeling. Something was drawing closer. Something that wore his own face in a way that unsettled him more deeply than any invention or broken world Rick had ever shown him. At night, the stars no longer looked like silent companions. They seemed like watchful eyes holding their breath. Morty lay in the grass as he always had, Summer beside him sometimes, Rick grumbling in the garage, and yet the silence had shifted. Where once it had offered comfort, it now pressed upon him like a question he could not answer. He thought of the reflections he had seen that night in the garage, the countless selves flickering across universes, and among them the one whose gaze was stripped bare of tenderness. That face lingered in him like a bruise, reminding him of what he could become if he let the weight of feeling curdle into emptiness. Rick noticed the change without asking about it. His voice grew sharper, his instructions quicker, but Morty understood it was not dismissal. It was deflection. Rick too had seen what the multiverse could make of a soul, and he carried his own shadows in silence. Morty wondered if Rick feared that he would become hardened in the same way, that the boy who stretched inward to hold the pain of others might someday snap, abandoning gentleness altogether. Rick never said it, but Morty felt it in the way his eyes lingered too long, in the hesitation before handing him a tool, as though testing whether Morty's heart could still bend without breaking. Summer, though younger in her understanding, felt the difference too. She teased less and asked more, her words careful in a way that told Morty she was watching closely. One evening, as the sky bruised into violet, she asked him if he ever wished he could stop caring so much. Morty did not answer right away. The question struck too close to the unease he carried, the silent fear that his caring might one day collapse under its own weight. But when he did answer, his voice was soft, almost a whisper. If I stopped, I wouldn't be me anymore. Summer didn't reply, only reached over to nudge his shoulder with hers, a small act that steadied him more than words could. Still, the unease deepened. Morty began to dream of corridors without end, each lined with doors that opened to versions of himself he did not recognize. Some cruel, some indifferent, some silent as stone. He would wake with his chest tight, the taste of those other selves lingering like smoke. In those dreams he always felt a presence walking just behind him, never speaking, never passing, only waiting. He knew who it was without needing to see. Evil Morty was not a stranger to him. Not really. He was the shadow of what Morty could become, the outcome of every moment when tenderness was set aside for the sake of survival. And though the days carried on in their ordinary rhythm, with Rick's machines humming and Summer's voice filling the air, Morty could feel the distance closing. The shadow was no longer content to stay in dreams or in flickering glimpses through unstable machines. It was moving nearer, step by step, testing the strength of Morty's quiet vow. He did not know when it would arrive, but he felt it in his bones. The time was coming when he would have to stand, not in the way of heroes with swords, but in the way only he could, with softness, with gentleness, with the quiet refusal to let his heart harden. It began as a whisper at the edges of Morty's waking hours, the kind of presence that seemed too faint to be real, yet too persistent to dismiss. He would catch it in moments of stillness, a flicker of thought not his own, a gaze brushing against him from somewhere unseen. At first he tried to ignore it, burying himself in the familiar rhythms, helping Rick in the garage, following Summer's chatter through the long evenings, lying under the stars as he always had. But the feeling clung to him, subtle but insistent, like the shadow of a figure just beyond the corner of his sight. He knew what it was. He had always known. The face that haunted his dreams was no longer confined to them. It was crossing into his days, into the spaces he once thought safe. The shift revealed itself most clearly one night, when Rick handed him a tool and turned back to his work. Morty held it steady, his hands sure, but as the machine sparked to life, a second hum seemed to pulse beneath it. It was faint, but it carried the same resonance Morty had felt within himself since childhood, only twisted, emptier, colder. His breath caught, and for a moment he thought the room itself bent around the sound. Rick, absorbed in calculations, didn't notice, but Morty felt it as surely as he felt his own heartbeat. The shadow wasn't just approaching, it was calling to him. Summer noticed the change in him the following day. He was quieter than usual, his gaze distant even when she teased him, and when she asked what was wrong, he could only shake his head. He didn't want to tell her about the presence, about the way it pressed against him like a question waiting to be answered. He feared that giving it words would make it stronger, yet his silence didn't fool her. She leaned closer, her tone softer than before, telling him she didn't need to know everything, only that he wasn't alone. Morty wanted to believe her, wanted to let her certainty shield him, but deep inside he knew that whatever was drawing near was something only he could face. The nights became heavier. He dreamed again of the endless corridors, doors opening to countless versions of himself. But this time, one of them stepped forward, no longer content to remain among the shadows. The figure moved with unsettling calm, eyes stripped of warmth, carrying the same face as Morty but hollow, as though every piece of softness had been carved out and discarded. When Morty tried to look away, the figure spoke without moving its lips, the words sinking into him like weight. "You can't hold it all forever. One day you'll break, and you'll become me." Morty woke, gasping, the echo of those words clinging to him long after the dream dissolved. Yet even as fear pressed closer, Morty felt something else stirring beneath it. The vow he had carried since childhood, unspoken but steady, began to pulse more strongly, as though it too sensed the test approaching. He realized then that his gift, his ability to feel, to stretch, to absorb, was not only a burden, it was also his answer. The shadow would try to strip it away, to hollow him out, but Morty's quiet promise was not so fragile. Each act of kindness, each silent bond with Summer, each unspoken thread between him and Rick had strengthened it. He was no longer just the boy who noticed silences. He was the boy who filled them, and so he waited, not with courage that blazed, but with a softer, steadier kind, the kind that held even as the air thickened, the kind that whispered back to the looming presence, "I will not break. I will not stop caring." Morty knew the shadow would not be content to linger much longer. It would step into his life fully sooner than he was ready. But he also knew that when it did, he would have to stand, not with force or brilliance, but with the same quiet vow that had shaped him since the beginning. The moment arrived quietly, almost disguised as another ordinary day. Morty had grown used to the hum of machines, to Rick's muttering calculations and Summer's offhand comments drifting through the house. But that day the air carried a thickness he couldn't shake. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury himself in routine, but every step seemed heavier, as if the ground itself knew what was approaching. By evening, when the house settled into its usual rhythm, the glow of Rick's garage lights spilling into the yard, the faint hum of inventions filling the silence, Morty felt it fully. The presence that had lingered at the edges of dreams, the figure that haunted his nights, was no longer waiting. It was here. He first saw it not in a dream, but in the reflection of the garage window. While Rick worked hunched over some contraption, sparks spitting into the air, Morty caught sight of himself in the glass. Yet the eyes staring back were not his own. They were colder, emptied of softness, as if the tenderness that lived in Morty had been stripped away. For a long moment he could not move. The reflection smirked faintly, a tilt of the head that mirrored his own movements too closely, and then it was gone, swallowed by the glare of light on the glass. Morty stumbled back, his breath sharp, but Rick didn't look up. The silence between them made the moment heavier, as though acknowledging it aloud would only give it more power. That night, Morty didn't sleep. He lay awake beneath the ceiling's shadows, listening to the faint creak of the house, every sound stretched taut with tension. When sleep finally claimed him, it pulled him into the familiar corridors, but this time there was no distance. The figure was waiting in the center of the hall, patient and still. Evil Morty's voice came without sound, settling directly into Morty's chest. "You know me. I am you without the weight of caring. I am what you'll become when you've carried too much for too long." The words were steady, calm, not cruel, and that made them more frightening. Morty wanted to argue, to shout that he would never allow himself to harden, but his voice would not rise in the dream. Only his silence answered. When he woke, the echo of that presence lingered, not fading as it usually did. He carried it with him through the day, through the small interactions that once brought him comfort. Summer's laughter no longer rang the same. Rick's silences felt sharper. He began to realize that the shadow wasn't only outside of him, creeping closer. It was inside him too, waiting for cracks to widen. The thought unsettled him, but it also clarified something. The battle ahead would not be with an enemy at a distance, but with a version of himself that had abandoned everything he valued. Still, in that unease, Morty held to the threads he had been weaving all along. Summer's quiet companionship, Rick's rare moments of unspoken trust, even the fragile kindnesses Morty offered to strangers. These were his anchors. They reminded him that the vow he had carried since childhood wasn't fragile at all. It was stronger than he believed, woven into him by every act of gentleness he had refused to let go of. The shadow had stepped into his world, and he could no longer pretend it wasn't there. But even as fear pressed against him, Morty felt the vow steady within him, a small light against the vast dark. And though he did not know how or when the confrontation would come, he understood now that his path was no longer about avoiding it. It was about standing in it, holding to his quiet promise, and refusing to let it be taken from him. Morty had expected the shadow to remain in the distance, a flicker in dreams, a face half hidden in reflections. But the day came when it no longer lingered at the edges. It stepped into his waking world with the same inevitability as dusk swallowing the last light of day. It happened in the garage, where Morty had grown used to the scent of metal and smoke, to the soft whir of machines that made the air feel alive. Rick had sent him to fetch a tool, something simple, and as Morty bent to pick it up, he felt the air shift, thick, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. When he straightened, he wasn't alone. Across the room, in the dim reflection of half-polished metal, he saw himself, not as he was, but as he feared he could become. The figure wasn't distorted or monstrous, it was simply him, his same height, his same face, but with eyes stripped bare of warmth, gaze steady in a way that felt colder than any machine. This version didn't need to speak at first. The silence between them was enough, weighted with a familiarity that unsettled Morty more deeply than any word could. Finally, the other stepped forward, and though Rick moved about the garage muttering to himself, it was as if he could not see. The shadow spoke in a voice identical to Morty's, yet sharper, cleaner, like an echo refined of softness. "You already know why I'm here. You've felt it. The weight you carry won't last. Sooner or later it breaks you. That's when you'll be me." Morty's breath caught, but he forced himself to meet the gaze. He wanted to deny it, to say he would never let go of what made him human, but the words tangled in his throat. Deep inside, he knew the danger was real. He had seen how exhaustion settled in Rick's eyes, how kindness could be worn down until only survival remained. The possibility of becoming this version of himself wasn't distant. It was close, only a few choices away. But then he remembered the small anchors he had gathered, the vow he had carried since childhood. He thought of Summer's quiet presence at his side, of Rick's rare but undeniable moments of trust, of the strangers whose pain he had absorbed without question. These were not grand victories, but they were threads strong enough to hold him. He steadied his voice and said softly, "I won't give it up. Not now, not ever." The shadow tilted its head, almost curious, as though studying a specimen. "You think promises are enough? The universe is cruel. It eats softness. It devours vows. When you break, you'll come to me. And when you do, you'll see that I was right." The words pressed against Morty like a cold wind, but instead of shrinking, he straightened. His fear did not vanish, but he carried it differently now, not as a weight crushing him, but as a reminder of what was at stake. He did not need to win a battle here, not in this moment. He only needed to refuse. The shadow lingered for a heartbeat longer, then dissolved back into the dim edges of the garage, leaving Morty trembling but unbroken. He said nothing to Rick, who hadn't noticed, nor to Summer, who would have asked too many questions. Instead, Morty carried the encounter in silence, letting it settle into him like a seed. He understood now that this was not the end of it. The shadow would return, more insistent each time, testing the edges of his vow. And though Morty was afraid, he also felt a strange steadiness. For the first time, he truly believed that gentleness was not a fragile thing. It could endure, it could stretch, and even if the universe pressed harder, he was ready to bend with it, rather than break. Morty carried the silence of that encounter with him, tucked beneath his skin like a bruise no one else could see. Days moved on with their familiar patterns. Rick bent over half-finished inventions, Summer's voice breaking through the hum of the house, the sky shifting through its endless colours. But Morty felt each moment stretch thinner, as though the world itself were testing the edges of his resolve. He still smiled when he was supposed to, still moved through the rhythms of ordinary life, yet beneath it all he felt the shadow pressing closer, its words lingering like a weight against his ribs. You can't hold it forever. You'll break. At school, the pressure showed in subtle ways. He noticed more than ever how people hid themselves in plain sight, how laughter could be forced, how confidence could be a mask. Each observation added to the heaviness inside him. Morty wanted to absorb it, to ease the burden for others, but he began to feel the limits of his own strength. It was as if every kindness pulled the vow tighter, stretching him farther, and though he refused to let go, the strain was undeniable. Sometimes, walking home, he would feel his chest ache with the effort of carrying so much unspoken weight, and for a fleeting second he understood what the shadow meant, that to care endlessly was to risk breaking entirely. But even in those moments of doubt, Morty found himself returning to the anchors he had built. Summer's presence, steady and wordless when she sat beside him under the stars, reminded him that gentleness wasn't his alone to carry. Rick's rare glances, sharp yet softened by a flicker of something unspoken, told Morty that even the most hardened soul could still see value in his quiet persistence. And the strangers he noticed, the ones who looked lighter after a kind word or a simple act of presence, these reminded him that his vow was not pointless. It left traces, however small, in the lives around him. Still, the strain grew. At night, his dreams deepened, and the corridors that had once stretched endlessly now narrowed, the doors closing one by one. Evil Morty appeared more often, no longer waiting in silence but speaking in tones that threaded into Morty's own thoughts. You think you're different, but every choice wears you down. Every act of kindness is another fracture. One day you won't have the strength to keep bending. The words seeped into him, chilling, because Morty could feel their truth pressing at the edges of his exhaustion. Yet each time the shadow's voice rose, Morty answered it not with argument but with refusal. He refused to turn away from Summer when she leaned on him. He refused to dismiss the quiet weight in Rick's silences. He refused to stop noticing the hidden aches of the people around him. Each refusal hurt, stretching him thinner, but each one also reaffirmed the vow that lived in him. It was not a loud defiance. It was not the kind of strength the universe celebrated, but it was steady, and it was his. He began to understand that this was what the shadow wanted, not just to frighten him, but to wear him down until his vow collapsed under its own weight. And Morty, feeling the strain tighten with every passing day, knew that the time was nearing when his refusal would no longer be enough. A moment was coming when he would have to face the shadow fully, not as a presence lurking at the edges, but as a force demanding that he choose who he would be. The breaking point arrived not with noise but with silence, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Morty had grown used to the weight he carried, the constant tension between his vow and the shadow pressing against it. But this night was different. The house was quiet in a way that unsettled him. No hum of Rick's machines, no muffled steps from Summer moving down the hall. He stepped outside into the yard where the grass glistened faintly under the starlight, and there, in the place that had always been his refuge, he felt the air thicken. The shadow was no longer lingering in dreams or reflections. It was here, standing across from him, as solid and undeniable as the earth beneath his feet. Evil Morty didn't speak right away. He only watched, his expression calm, his presence steady, as if he had all the time in the world. Morty felt his chest tighten, not from fear alone, but from recognition. Looking into those eyes was like looking into the future he was terrified of becoming. The shadow finally broke the silence with a voice that was his own, sharpened and emptied of tenderness. This is where it ends. Not in battle, not in fire, just in choice. You can't hold both forever, the vow and the weight. One will give, and when it does, you'll understand me. Morty swallowed, his hands trembling at his sides. He thought of every moment that had led here, the quiet promises he had made to himself as a child, the small kindnesses that had steadied him, the way Summer leaned on him, the way Rick, without saying it, trusted him. He thought of how tired he felt, how the weight of caring for everyone else sometimes pressed him to the edge of collapse. The shadow's words struck deep because they weren't lies. Morty knew the risk. He knew how easily compassion could fracture under the strain of a cruel universe. But as the silence stretched, Morty realized something he hadn't before. The vow wasn't a burden chained to him. It was a part of him, woven into every breath, every act, every refusal to let go. It had grown roots, and those roots had spread too deeply to be torn out. He looked at the shadow, meeting that hollow gaze, and for the first time he spoke without hesitation. "You're not my future. You're just what happens when I stop being myself, and I won't stop, no matter how heavy it gets." The shadow tilted its head, almost curious, almost disappointed. "You think you can bend forever? That's not strength. That's weakness waiting to snap." Morty shook his head. "It's not weakness to care. It's not weakness to keep bending. Strength isn't about not breaking. It's about not hardening." The words surprised even him as they left his mouth, yet once spoken, they felt undeniable. Something shifted in the air, not with a dramatic clash, but with a subtle unraveling. The shadow's form flickered, its presence wavering as though Morty's refusal had shaken the foundation it stood on. For a moment, the hollow eyes seemed to search his, looking for doubt, but Morty didn't flinch. He stood in the quiet strength he had been building all his life, not loud, not heroic, but steady. Slowly the shadow began to fade, dissolving into the night air. Its voice lingered, softer now, almost like a warning whispered into his bones. "We'll see how long you last." And then it was gone, leaving Morty alone beneath the stars. He stood there for a long time, trembling but unbroken, the cool air wrapping around him like a blanket. The silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt earned. He had not defeated the shadow, not entirely. It would return in moments of weakness, in nights of doubt. But he had faced it and remained himself. And as he lay down in the grass, looking up at the endless sky, Morty felt a quiet certainty settle within him. His vow was not fragile. It was alive, and it would endure as long as he chose to keep it. The night after the shadow faded left Morty restless, though not in the way fear once kept him awake. This time it was a kind of quiet alertness, as though the air itself had shifted, leaving behind traces of something unfinished. He lay in the grass until dawn, his eyes following the slow paling of the stars, and for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't dread the silence. He felt it settle around him like a companion, not pressing, not suffocating, but waiting. In that stillness, Morty understood something that had eluded him before. His vow wasn't just about refusing to harden. It was about giving shape to the lives around him, even when no one noticed. The days that followed seemed ordinary on the surface, but Morty carried himself differently. At school he still stumbled, still flushed when he misspoke, yet there was a steadiness in him now that couldn't be shaken. He noticed how people leaned into his presence without realizing it. The classmate who sat beside him unasked, the teacher who paused just a little longer when meeting his eyes. Morty had always felt the weight of others' hurts, but now he realized his presence could ease them, not by solving or fixing, but simply by being there. This realization deepened his vow. It was no longer only about resisting the shadow. It was about shaping a space where gentleness could survive in a world determined to erase it. Rick, though never one to say it outright, seemed to sense the change too. He gave Morty harder tasks, left him alone with machines that hummed with dangerous potential, and watched carefully when Morty steadied them. The old man never praised him, but there was a hesitation before the usual muttered insult, and in that hesitation, Morty felt the acknowledgement he needed. He could see it in Rick's eyes, that fleeting flicker of recognition, the unspoken admission that Morty's strength was different, but no less real. It made Morty wonder if, in some way, Rick had always hoped he would choose this path. Not brilliance, not ruthlessness, but endurance. Summer was more direct. One evening she sat beside him, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the fading horizon. "You've changed," she said simply, without teasing. Morty tried to deny it, but she shook her head. "You carry yourself different now. Stronger. Not louder, just stronger." Morty didn't know how to respond, so he stayed quiet, and Summer let the silence linger. Her words, though simple, rooted themselves in him, reinforcing what he already felt, that the vow was no longer just something he carried in secret. It was something others could see, even if they didn't name it. Yet even as this quiet strength grew, Morty felt the shadow's presence lingering in the corners of his mind. It hadn't vanished completely. It had only retreated, waiting for cracks to appear. At night, when the stars seemed too far away, Morty would feel the echo of that hollow gaze pressing against him. But instead of fear, he answered with steadiness. He remembered the small kindnesses that had shaped him, the anchors that had held him through the weight. He reminded himself that strength was not the absence of shadow, but the choice to stand in its presence without surrendering. Morty began to sense that his vow was shaping not only himself, but the people around him. Summer leaned closer. Rick, in his fractured way, trusted him more. Even strangers who crossed his path seemed touched by his quiet persistence. He realized then that a legacy wasn't built in grand gestures or loud victories. It was built in the invisible ways one life bent toward another, in the gentle threads that lingered long after words were forgotten. And as this understanding deepened, Morty knew he was moving toward something larger, a moment when the vow would no longer be about surviving the shadow, but about leaving behind a light strong enough to guide others, even in his absence. The change in Morty wasn't a flash of light or a moment anyone could point to. It was slower than that, quieter, like the way daylight shifts across a room without anyone noticing, until the shadows fall in new places. But it was there. It was in how Rick's voice lowered, just slightly, when he spoke to Morty. It was in the way Summer stopped interrupting his silences. Even the house felt different, less tense, less full of the frantic noise that had once filled the spaces where no one dared to be still. Morty hadn't asked for any of it. He hadn't tried to fix anyone. He had just stayed, soft, steady, listening when the world gave him the chance. And somehow, that had begun to matter. Rick was the last person anyone would call emotionally reachable. His way of loving people had always come laced with sarcasm, avoidance, and 1,000 half-finished devices he'd rather stare into than meet someone's eyes. But even Rick, in his own strange orbit, was changing. Not in a way he'd ever admit. He still barked orders, still rolled his eyes like a reflex. But something about the sharpness had dulled. He started leaving notes for Morty, scribbled instructions instead of frustrated yelling. He passed him tools with less impatience, and once, in a rare moment between experiments, Rick paused at the garage door and muttered, "You're holding up better than I expected." It wasn't a compliment, not really. But Morty understood. It was Rick's way of saying, "I see you." And Morty, who had never needed his grandfather to be anything more than honest, felt the weight of that shift like a quiet warmth. Summer, too, had changed in ways that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Her teasing was still there, still sharp and fast, but she watched Morty differently now, not like a younger brother she had to push around, but like someone she trusted to carry real weight. They walked more often in silence, and when she did speak, her words landed softer. One night, as they lay in the grass and listened to the sky whisper its usual mysteries, she said, without looking at him, "I thought you'd crack." Morty waited, not defensive. She went on, "But you didn't. You just kept showing up." Morty didn't know what to say. He never had the perfect answer when it mattered most. But he reached out and nudged her shoulder with his, the same way she had done for him months ago, back when everything inside him was shaking. She smiled. It was small, crooked, but real. And in that moment, something passed between them that didn't need naming, a quiet agreement that they were carrying one another now. Even the world beyond their home began to reflect Morty's quiet persistence. He noticed people leaning on him without realizing it, classmates asking questions they could have Googled, neighbors lingering longer in conversation, strangers pausing before walking past him, as if drawn to something soft they hadn't expected. He didn't always know what to say. He didn't always have answers. But he stayed. He listened, and the people around him left lighter, even if they never understood why. The shadow had not returned, but Morty could still feel its echo, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the stillness just before sleep. It no longer frightened him. It reminded him. That part of him would always exist, the potential to close off, to grow hard, to choose detachment over feeling. But he had chosen otherwise, again and again, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. And now that choice was no longer just shaping him. It was shaping those closest to him. Rick's eyes lingered longer. Summer's laughter rang more often without defensiveness. Even in the silence, Morty felt their unspoken gratitude. They would never say it, but he didn't need them to. He had learned to recognize the shape of love that didn't come with big declarations. It was there in the quiet things, in Rick's steadier voice, in Summer's softened footsteps, in the way they didn't try to make him different anymore. Morty understood finally that legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you gave away a little at a time. In every moment you chose to stay soft in a world that pushed against softness. His vow had become more than a promise. It was becoming a path, and those around him, whether they admitted it or not, were starting to walk it with him. There was something different about the way people looked at Morty now. Not awe, not fear, not even admiration. It was subtler than all that. It was the kind of glance people give to someone who has been there, who has stayed when others walked away, who listens without turning everything into a lesson. Morty hadn't tried to change how he moved through the world. He just kept showing up, quiet, gentle, present. But slowly, without realizing it, the world had begun to turn its gaze toward him, not because he asked for it, but because he made space where others had left none. It started with one of the teachers at school, a man known for being firm, distant, eyes always flicking toward the clock. One morning, as students packed up, he lingered by Morty's desk. Nothing big, just a hand resting on the edge of the desk, just long enough for Morty to glance up. The teacher didn't say much. He only asked if Morty was doing okay. And when Morty said yes, the man nodded once and walked away. But Morty could see it, the weight behind the eyes, the quiet hope in asking. Someone who never reached out had reached out to him, because somehow Morty had become someone. People reached toward when they didn't know where else to go. The shift spread slowly. He wasn't suddenly popular. He wasn't loud enough for that. But more people began sitting next to him without asking. More questions, more pauses in the hallway, more moments when someone would say, "Hey, I've been meaning to ask you something," and then take 10 minutes before saying anything at all. And Morty learned that it wasn't always about having an answer. Sometimes it was enough just to be still, to let someone speak without interruption, to hold space that didn't rush in to fix or explain. Rick noticed too, though he never brought it up directly. One night, while tinkering with something Morty didn't recognize, he looked up and said, "You're becoming a gravity well." Morty raised an eyebrow, confused. Rick kept working. "Things are starting to orbit you. People, ideas, choices. You're pulling more than you think." Then he handed Morty a tool, as if the conversation was over. But Morty understood. Rick had seen what was happening, even if he'd never used words like kindness or presence. He saw the shift in the way only Rick could, through the lens of physics, inevitability, mass. And Morty held that strange compliment in his chest like a candle, unsure what to do with it, but warmed by the light all the same. Even Summer, who usually avoided any kind of sappiness, had her own way of acknowledging it. One afternoon, while walking home, she bumped into him with her shoulder and said, "You're turning into some kind of soft-spoken prophet or something. It's weird." But then, more quietly, she added, "I'm glad you didn't let this place turn you cold." She didn't wait for a response. She just kept walking, her pace a little slower than usual, as if inviting Morty to walk beside her, instead of trailing behind like he used to. The weight was still there. Morty could feel it always, the old ache of carrying too much for too long. The shadow hadn't returned, but its echo lingered, a reminder of what still waited at the edges if he ever let go of what kept him steady. But the difference now was that Morty wasn't holding the weight alone. Others had started carrying it with him, even if they didn't realize it. His vow, once internal, once silent, had become something shared, something contagious. Not in grand gestures, but in how people paused, how they listened, how they softened when they were near him. Morty hadn't set out to change anyone. He hadn't tried to teach. But by refusing to harden, by staying soft even when it hurt, he had opened a door that others had begun to walk through. And the world around him, piece by piece, had started to bend, not in surrender, but in response, as if it too had been waiting for someone to prove that gentleness was still possible. It was never a question of if something beyond would take notice, only when. The universe, vast and layered, had always watched, in its own strange ways, not with eyes, but with tremors, with slow turns of gravity and soft disruptions in the order of things. And now, with Morty at the quiet center of it, something had begun to shift just slightly off balance, not in chaos, but in curiosity. It began subtly, a pattern in Rick's readings that didn't fit, a repeated signal that looked like background noise but returned at the exact same time every night. Rick grunted at it, dismissed it twice, then furrowed his brow on the third pass. "Something's pinging from outside the loop," he muttered, tapping at the screen with the back of a screwdriver like he could knock sense into the data. Morty stood beside him, arms crossed, trying not to let the chill under his skin show. Rick didn't explain further. He never did when he was unsettled. But Morty felt it too. Not the signal. He couldn't read the machines the way Rick could, but the echo of attention, like something brushing against the edge of his thoughts. It wasn't the shadow this time. It wasn't familiar. It was watching, but not threatening. Curious, even gentle, but vast, like a planet leaning in to listen to a child whisper. At school, he noticed strangers watching him with a little more stillness. People he'd never spoken to began sitting closer, not intrusively, just near enough to feel the warmth. Words reached him second-hand, people asking, "What's up with him?" But in tones that weren't mocking. Something was moving through the world, carried not by him, but through him. Morty remained the same. He still offered his presence the way he always had, steady, careful, honest. But now others responded as if they felt it pulsing like a rhythm they didn't know they'd been missing. That night, after the third day of strange readings, Rick sat him down without preamble. His voice was lower than usual, rough around the edges. "You're resonating," he said. "Not just emotionally, cosmically. Whatever you're doing, the universe is picking it up." Morty blinked. "What do you mean, resonating?" Rick shrugged. "I mean, you're creating order in places that are built on noise, calm in systems that feed on disruption. That kind of coherence doesn't go unnoticed." He paused. "Especially not by them." Morty didn't ask who them was. He could see in Rick's face that even he wasn't sure. It wasn't a threat, not yet, but it was enough to make Rick install 3 new failsafes and keep a monitor on overnight. Something had shifted, and not just in the numbers. Morty felt it in his chest like a quiet hum, the way he used to feel before storms, only this wasn't dread, it was anticipation. Later, when the house was silent and the sky had turned that soft blue-black that signaled true night, Morty stepped outside and sat beneath it. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He just breathed, slow and steady, letting the air move through him. And somewhere far beyond, the stars he could see, something stirred, just enough to notice that he was still there. Still choosing gentleness, still choosing to stay soft in a universe full of jagged edges. The message didn't come in words, but Morty felt it anyway, like warmth pressed gently against the base of his spine. A kind of welcome, a kind of warning. He understood without needing explanation. The vow he had carried all this time had begun to ripple outward, and the universe, in all its strange and unknowable watching, had begun to ripple back. In the following days, the sense of being watched didn't fade. It settled. It became part of the rhythm of Morty's life, like background music he couldn't turn off, not threatening, but present. Something vast was listening now, and Morty wasn't sure what it wanted, if it wanted anything at all. But he felt its patience. It was the patience of deep time, of stars waiting to be named, of oceans folding and unfolding for millennia. Whatever it was, it had no urgency, only interest. Rick, for all his intelligence, grew quiet about the signal. He'd still monitor it, sometimes spending whole nights in the garage with his mouth set in a tight line, muttering to himself. But he stopped explaining, maybe because he didn't have an explanation, maybe because he knew Morty wouldn't need one. The boy had already outgrown the kind of answers Rick once used to stitch over uncertainty. There were no equations for what Morty had chosen to carry. Summer, too, felt the shift, though she couldn't name it. She watched Morty more often now, not with suspicion, but with the sort of quiet reverence people give to someone who has gone somewhere they cannot follow. She never said as much, but Morty could feel it in her questions. They came slower now, more thoughtful. Less about teasing, more about understanding. One night she looked at him under the porch light and said, "Do you ever feel like you're not just here?" He nodded before she could finish. She nodded back like she already knew. The real shift came on a Tuesday. Harmless, ordinary, forgettable, until it wasn't. Morty was walking home alone, the sky a soft steel grey when the world paused. Not stopped exactly. Just hesitated. He felt it in the way the wind went silent, how the clouds above him froze in place, their motion halted mid-swirl. The birds fell quiet. The cars in the distance seemed muted, and then, in the stillness, he saw something move, not through space, but with it. A figure stepped forward, unfolding from the fabric of the air itself. Not dramatic, not ominous, just present. It wasn't Evil Morty. This one was taller, older, dressed in the same colours Morty wore, only softened by time. His expression wasn't cold, it was unreadable, like the expression of someone who had waited a very long time for something fragile to bloom. "You've kept it alive," the figure said. No introduction, no explanation, just that. His voice didn't echo, but it pressed gently into Morty's ribs, as if meant to be felt more than heard. Morty didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. The figure stepped closer. "We don't last long, most of us. The vow, it usually breaks, or bends so far it forgets its shape, but you've kept yours, and that matters now." Morty swallowed. "Who are you?" The figure tilted his head. "Another version of you, far from here, one who didn't forget, one who held the line long enough for others to find it again." He didn't glow, he didn't shimmer, but something in him vibrated with the same quiet weight Morty carried, a familiarity that settled into Morty like returning to a room he'd never been in, but somehow already knew. "I don't have long," the figure said, "but I came to tell you this. The vow isn't just survival anymore. It's becoming a pattern, a kind of resonance the multiverse is beginning to notice. You've made stillness contagious. And it's spreading." Morty's breath caught in his throat. Not fear, not even awe, just the deep realization that something he thought was small, quiet, private, personal, was no longer only his. The figure reached out, but didn't touch him. "You won't see the full reach of it. That's not your part to play. But know this, Morty, every time you chose not to turn away, not to harden, not to lash out, you moved something, even in places you'll never visit." Then just as he had appeared, the figure faded, not vanished, not gone, but folded back into the fabric of reality like the end of a breath. The wind returned. The sky resumed its turning. The street noise picked up again as if nothing had paused at all. Morty stood still for a long time. Then he began walking again, not faster, not slower, just steady. He didn't need a purpose bigger than the vow. He didn't need an audience. He only needed to keep choosing it again and again, not because the universe was watching, but because it wasn't, because softness mattered, especially when no one was there to see it. Morty didn't tell anyone about the figure. Not Rick, not Summer. Not because he wanted to keep it secret, but because there was nothing to explain. It hadn't been a message, not exactly. It had been a mirror, a confirmation. And though it left no trace behind, no scorch mark, no altered frequency, no memory in anyone else's mind, Morty felt different. Not louder, not prouder, just clearer. Like the path he'd been walking, once so faint and uncertain, had begun to firm beneath his feet. The next morning, he caught himself watching the way someone else sat in silence. A boy at school he didn't know well, always sitting near the back, shoulders hunched, gaze low. The sort of quiet that came not from peace but from being forgotten. Morty didn't approach him, not immediately. But the next day, he sat a little closer, and the day after that, he let his bag fall onto the desk beside. Him said nothing, just stayed. It took a week before the boy spoke. Not much. Just a dry comment about the teacher's weird shoes. But Morty smiled, and the boy smiled back, and it was enough. It became a rhythm. Morty started noticing the quiet edges where people stood not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know how to step forward. He didn't fix them. He didn't lift them up like some kind of hero. He just stood near them until they remembered they weren't invisible. He didn't realize how much it mattered until one afternoon, someone did the same for him. A girl from a different class, someone he'd helped carry books months ago without thinking twice, stopped him in the hall and said, "You look tired." Morty blinked. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small folded paper. "I thought this helped," she said. "It probably won't, but you're the kind of person who deserves a try." When she walked away, Morty unfolded the paper. Inside was a doodle of a turtle carrying a house on its back, the words, "Take your time." "You always do," scrawled underneath. He stood there for longer than he meant to, staring at it, stunned by the smallness of it, how something so soft could carry such weight. Rick noticed the shift too. One night, watching Morty solder a small circuit, he said without looking up, "You're building more than machines now." He didn't explain. He didn't have to. Rick's compliments were like meteors, rare, and they left a dent when they landed. Morty just nodded, kept soldering, but in his chest the warmth bloomed slow and deep. Summer had her own way of acknowledging it. She started calling Morty Zen Boy when no one was around. Said it with a smirk, but she'd linger in doorways more often, sit beside him on the porch longer, ask questions that didn't need answers. She'd always been sharp, fast, a little defensive. But now there were pauses, not weakness, space. Morty didn't take credit for that, but he did notice, and slowly the quiet began to spread. A teacher started leaving extra chairs near Morty's desk, unspoken invitations. A janitor began cleaning that wing last, so students could linger a little longer. A girl started bringing 2 thermoses to class instead of 1. Nothing dramatic, no grand speeches, just small, soft shifts in how people held each other, how they waited, how they stayed. Morty began to understand that his vow had passed through him into others, not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as an instinct, an atmosphere. He didn't need to lead them. He just needed to keep being the version of himself that reminded people it was possible to live without armoring up. That gentleness wasn't a prelude to defeat. It was its own kind of defense, and a powerful one. He remembered what the older version of himself had said, that he wouldn't see the full reach of the vow, and maybe that was true, but he was starting to see the edges of it now. The first ripples. The first rooms where silence didn't feel lonely anymore. And in that quiet blooming, Morty realized something deeper. He wasn't just resisting the shadow anymore. He was outgrowing it. The ripple reached him first in small, almost imperceptible ways. A classmate who had always kept to the edges now paused in the hall just long enough for Morty to notice the shift. A hesitant smile, the kind that had never belonged to her before. Morty didn't approach immediately. He only let her presence linger beside his own, offering the quiet steadiness he had learned to hold for others. Days later, she lingered again, carrying a sketchbook she'd never brought to school, opening it with trembling fingers to show him a drawing of stars and tiny bridges connecting them. No words accompanied it. Morty only nodded, feeling the gentle weight of the gift as if it had always been meant for him. he began noticing the pattern emerging in more places. Small acts of attention, small gestures that could have been forgotten, now carried a different resonance. The janitor, always silent, left extra cleaning supplies for the students who needed them most. A teacher who had once hurried past him now paused, asking how Morty had solved a problem on the board. He didn't answer with pride, he just smiled, letting them feel seen without explanation. Summer noticed too, though she rarely admitted it. One evening, she lingered in the garage doorway while Morty tinkered with a small gadget. "You're changing them," she said softly, almost afraid to speak it. "Everyone. They're different because you're here." Morty glanced up, meeting her eyes. He didn't need words to confirm it. He felt it everywhere, in the pauses between breaths, in the hesitations and smiles, in the quiet turns of attention he had never sought but had nonetheless earned. Rick, of course, remained gruff, muttering and muttering as he worked, but the pauses in his grumbling grew longer. The way he left tools for Morty without scolding, the subtle nod when a problem was solved without his interference, these were signs Rick didn't often give. Morty noticed, storing them like small treasures, the acknowledgement of a quiet shift that no one else would call out. And still, the shadow lingered in memory. Morty knew it had not vanished, only receded, waiting at the edges of possibility for moments of fatigue, doubt, or weariness. But the ripples he had sent out, the small spaces of gentleness he had created in others, were becoming shields, not walls. They were subtle, yet resilient, bending the course of quiet hearts toward care, toward connection, toward staying soft in a world that often demanded hardness. One afternoon, as he walked home under a sky brushed with late sun, a boy from another class fell behind, walking slowly with no one beside him. Morty didn't ask questions. He didn't lecture. He only slowed his pace, letting space stretch between them. And then, without a word, the boy matched it, feeling the rhythm of the quiet Morty had carried for years. When they reached the corner where paths diverged, the boy turned briefly, eyes wide and unaccustomed to such attention, and nodded. Morty smiled softly. It was a gesture small enough to be forgotten, yet powerful enough to leave a trace. That evening, beneath the quiet canopy of stars, Morty realized the truth of what he had been doing all along. The vow, once just a way to survive the shadow, had grown into something larger, a force subtle enough to move through worlds, strong enough to create shelter in moments of exposure. And he understood finally that the shadow's reach was no longer the measure of his strength. It was the presence of care and the willingness to persist in it that would determine the shape of the spaces he inhabited. As the weeks passed, Morty began noticing subtler currents of change moving through the world around him. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but in small ways the rhythm of life had started to bend toward the quiet steadiness he had cultivated. In classrooms, voices softened when he spoke, not because he demanded it, but because he had modeled the patience to listen. Hallways that had once been spaces of hurried footsteps and indifferent glances now held micro moments of connection. A classmate letting someone cut ahead, a teacher lingering with a question, a student smiling at someone they barely knew. Morty did nothing extraordinary. He didn't hand out lessons or issue advice. He simply existed in the pattern of care he had been building all along, and that presence spread imperceptibly, like a ripple through still water. Even Summer, who had grown used to teasing and brash humour, reflected the subtle shift. She lingered longer in spaces she used to rush through, noticed small gestures she once ignored, and occasionally glanced at Morty with something unspoken in her eyes. Acknowledgement, gratitude, maybe wonder. She didn't articulate it, but Morty felt it in the pauses they shared, in the silences that now carried meaning rather than emptiness. Rick, for his part, still grumbled and muttered as though nothing had changed, yet the small ways he altered his behaviour, leaving tools, tolerating mistakes, offering a rare nod of approval, spoke volumes to Morty about the resonance of his quiet persistence. The world itself seemed to bend toward him too. In the park, strangers offered brief, unprompted acts of courtesy. At the corner store, a child lingered to let someone pass, a gesture so slight it might have gone unnoticed, yet it mirrored the gentleness Morty had cultivated. Each time he observed such a small shift, a quiet reassurance settled in his chest. He hadn't only kept his vow alive, He had begun shaping the spaces around him, subtly altering the tone of interaction, the rhythm of thought, the heartbeat of ordinary life. And yet, the shadow was still there, not as a force pressing in, but as a distant echo, reminding him that nothing persisted without effort, that softness could be tested. Morty welcomed it now, not with fear, but with awareness. He understood that the presence of a challenge sharpened the edges of his persistence, that vigilance wasn't only for survival, but for growth. He walked through the world more intentionally, noticing the micro moments that might be overlooked, giving them weight without seeking recognition, letting his quiet influence extend farther than he could measure. Under the pale glow of evening, he would pause in the familiar quiet of the yard, looking at the sky as though it were listening. And in those moments, he understood the depth of what he had built, a network of softness, patience, and unspoken care, stretching outward from himself, touching people who might never know the source of the change. It wasn't grand or spectacular, but it was enduring. It was real. And in the presence of the shadow that had once threatened to consume him, Morty finally realized that the vow he had carried all his life had become more than a promise. It had become a quiet architecture of connection that no darkness could undo. The weeks folded into months, and Morty began to see the subtle ways his presence had begun to extend beyond the people he knew. It wasn't immediate or loud. He didn't command attention or seek recognition, but he noticed patterns that seemed almost impossible to trace back to him. A classmate he barely spoke to now offered help without being asked. A neighbor lingered in the yard to listen, not to talk, but to simply be present. Even the smallest gestures, a door held, a smile shared, a question asked with genuine curiosity, echoed faintly along the currents Morty had created. Rick, of course, never acknowledged it. He still muttered and grumbled as though the world hadn't shifted at all. Yet Morty caught the small ways the old man's behavior had changed. A tool left exactly where Morty needed it, a glance that lingered just a moment longer before Rick's usual dismissal. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But Morty knew. He understood now that influence wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it existed entirely in the quiet decisions others made in response to one's presence. Summer noticed too in ways she didn't name. Her pauses lasted a little longer, her laughter softened, her words carried weight she once spared for sarcasm alone. Occasionally she caught him staring out a window, and instead of teasing, she would sit beside him and let the silence hold them both. Morty realized that the people closest to him were beginning to reflect the quiet strength he carried. Not because he told them to, but because he had remained consistent, present, and gentle in a world that often demanded hardness. One evening, as dusk settled into the yard and the first stars began to gleam faintly overhead, Morty saw the evidence most clearly. A group of children he had never met before gathered in the park, mimicking gestures he had long ago offered to his friends. Patience in waiting their turn, kindness in listening, empathy in their play. It wasn't a conscious effort, Morty knew. They didn't realize the source, but the pattern had formed, spreading outward like ripples in water, touching places he could not see directly. The shadow lingered in memory, quiet now, distant, less urgent, but Morty felt its echo still. It reminded him that nothing endured without intention, that even the faintest soft currents could be tested by time or circumstance. But Morty also understood that influence worked both ways. The ripple he had sent outward returned to him, subtly reinforcing the same vow he had carried since childhood. Even in moments of fatigue or doubt, the world's responses, the softened voices, the careful pauses, the small acts of unseen kindness, reminded him that gentleness could be contagious, resilient, and enduring. Standing beneath the deepening night, Morty exhaled slowly. The sky stretched endlessly above, and though he could not measure the full reach of the ripples he had set in motion, he felt them. He felt the quiet architecture of care and patience he had built, stretching across spaces, touching lives in ways invisible yet profound. And in that realization, Morty understood that the vow he had carried all along, the vow to remain soft, to stay present, to care even when it hurt, was no longer only his own. It was alive, shaping not only him, but the world around him, quietly, patiently, irrevocably. Morty began to notice the subtler echoes of his choices in places he had never expected. A neighbour lingered a little longer on the porch when someone fell behind on the sidewalk, offering assistance without being asked. In the classroom, gestures of patience and listening, once uncommon, appeared more frequently, as if the small habits Morty had modelled had begun to ripple outward. He didn't take credit. He only watched, understanding that influence was rarely visible in real time. Sometimes it returned to him in ways he could feel but not measure. A pause in conversation, a softer tone, a brief smile that lingered longer than necessary. Rick, of course, never commented. He still muttered and grumbled, his presence a whirlwind of mechanical clatter and curt directives. But Morty noticed the differences. Tools left precisely where he needed them, instructions given with a fraction more patience, a nod that lingered just a moment longer than usual. Rick's acknowledgement was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, yet it carried more weight than any verbal praise ever could. Morty stored these small markers quietly, letting them reinforce the rhythm he had already cultivated, an understanding that consistency and presence could speak louder than words. Summer's attention followed its own pattern. She had grown used to the rhythm of Morty's steadiness and her teasing, softened, less pointed, more reflective. She lingered beside him in spaces where she once hurried, asking questions with genuine curiosity rather than the sharpness of habit. Occasionally she caught him gazing at the horizon, the distant sky bruised by twilight, and simply sat with him. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The silence had grown weighty with understanding, the kind of bond that passes through small gestures rather than grand declarations. Even beyond the immediate people around him, Morty could feel the extensions of his quiet influence. Children he had never met mirrored the patience and attentiveness he had modelled. Small kindnesses and hesitations once absent from their interactions began appearing almost instinctively. Morty observed without intervening, realizing that gentleness had become a rhythm in spaces he could not touch directly. He saw, in these minor acts of unprompted care, a reflection of his vow, a promise no longer contained within his own heart but extending outward, bending the edges of the world towards subtle goodness. At night, as he stood beneath the expansive sky, Morty felt the weight of it all settle around him. The echoes of the shadow were faint now, a distant reminder that vigilance was still necessary, that softness could still be tested. Yet the world's response, the pauses, the small acts, the quiet attentiveness, reinforced him. His vow had not only endured but begun to propagate, taking root in places and people he could never fully trace. It was both humbling and affirming, the realization that persistence in gentleness could shape more than a single life. And in the stillness beneath the stars, Morty understood that the ripples of his vow were a legacy in themselves, not written in monuments or announced by triumphs, but etched into the rhythm of daily life, into choices made quietly and consistently. He felt a strange calm, knowing that even if he could never see the full reach of his influence, it had already begun to shape a world that piece by piece reflected the patience, presence, and care he had chosen to uphold. Morty began to understand, in the quiet hours when the sky was deepest and the stars seemed closer than they had ever felt, that his influence had grown beyond the simple confines of his home or school. It was no longer just Summer leaning a little closer, Rick leaving tools in perfect order, or a classmate hesitating before rushing past. It had started to seep into moments that seemed trivial at first glance, a stranger pausing to hold a door, a child waiting patiently for a turn, a fleeting gesture of attention unnoticed but meaningful. Each one was a thread, weaving outward from him, creating a subtle lattice of care and presence that bound the world in ways he could barely comprehend. He thought back to the shadow, to the version of himself that had existed as a warning in dreams and reflections. That shadow had loomed as a threat to gentleness, a test of endurance. And yet, here he was, not hardened, not broken, but quietly transforming the spaces around him. Morty realized that the vow he had carried for so long, the insistence on softness, attention, and presence, was no longer merely a shield. It had become a conduit, a way for others to practice gentleness without knowing why, to pause, to listen, to extend care simply because it was possible. Rick had been watching in his own way, as always. Morty didn't need to hear him say it aloud. He could sense it in the subtle shifts, in the absence of complaints where there might have been frustration, in the brief nods that acknowledged effort without words. Even Summer reflected it back in her lingering glances, in the pauses that allowed space for thought, in questions asked with curiosity rather than impatience. Morty began to understand that these responses were part of the same pattern, the ripples of his vow manifesting in forms he could feel but not fully trace. One evening, beneath a sky that hung low and heavy with stars, Morty walked slowly through the quiet streets. He could see the echoes of his presence in small acts around him, a neighbour helping someone who had dropped their groceries, children letting one another pass, faint smiles exchanged where once there had been none. It was a subtle chorus of attention, patience and care, and it hummed in the air like a soft melody he could not quite name. He realized that the vow had begun to exist beyond him, taking shape in the world itself, stretching in ways even the shadow could not touch. And in that moment, Morty felt the weight he had carried for so long transform. Not vanish, not dissipate, but settle into something steady, expansive, enduring. The shadow was no longer the measure of his strength. The measure was here, in the quiet turns of the world toward kindness, in the subtle pauses and attentiveness that had begun to ripple outward from him. He didn't need recognition or reward. The legacy was already taking form. The vow had become its own living thing, moving gently through people, shaping the rhythm of their interactions, and quietly proving that softness could persist, endure, and grow even when it was invisible. Morty realized, as the days stretched into quiet evenings, that the ripples he had created were no longer subtle. They had begun to weave together into patterns he could sense, even if he could not see them fully. In the small gestures of those around him, the way a neighbour offered help without being asked, the way classmates lingered in conversation rather than rushing past, the way Summer and Rick reflected steadiness back to him. He felt the culmination of the vow he had carried for so long. Each act of gentleness, each refusal to harden in the face of pressure, had combined into something larger than himself. He walked through the yard one evening, the sky stretching in infinite shades of navy and violet, and thought about the shadow that had once haunted him. It had not returned, not as a threat, but its memory lingered as a reminder of what he might have become if he had given in. And yet, even that memory now felt distant, more like a story than a looming presence. Morty understood that the shadow had served its purpose. It had tested him, shaped him, and now, in a way he could feel but not explain, it had allowed him to transcend the narrow confines of his own fear and uncertainty. Rick, as he moved about the garage tinkering with yet another improbable contraption, cast glances at Morty that were harder to read than ever. Not approval, not mockery, something in between. Recognition without words. Morty didn't ask, nor did he expect an explanation. He only absorbed it, knowing that even the briefest acknowledgement from Rick carried weight. Summer, meanwhile, lingered more often in the quiet spaces, allowing her presence to speak for the trust and understanding she no longer needed to verbalize. The world around Morty had begun to mirror the steadiness he had cultivated in himself. One night, sitting beneath the stars, Morty reflected on all the small threads he had woven over the years. The echoes of kindness, the subtle attentiveness, the quiet willingness to stay soft in a world that often demanded hardness. All of it had coalesced into something larger than his own life. He realized that legacy was not defined by grand gestures or dramatic victories. It was created in persistence, in the invisible acts that ripple outward, touching people and shaping spaces in ways that may never be fully seen or understood. As he gazed at the vast, glittering sky, Morty felt a profound calm settle over him. The vow he had carried since childhood, tested again and again by shadows both literal and metaphorical, had endured. It had grown roots, and those roots had begun to shape not only the people closest to him, but the subtle rhythms of the world itself. Even if he could never see the full extent of it, Morty knew that his quiet influence was real, and in that knowledge he found a sense of closure, a deep satisfaction, and a gentle wonder that the smallest choices, staying soft, staying present, caring when it hurt, could ripple outward to leave the world a little gentler than it had been. The nights grew slower now, almost contemplative, as if the universe itself had softened in response to the steady persistence Morty carried. He often lingered beneath the stars, letting the cool air brush across his skin, listening to the faint hum of life in the yard, the distant murmur of streets, the soft rustle of leaves. Everything felt connected, woven together by threads he could not see but could sense. The small kindnesses he had offered, the attentiveness he had modelled, the patience he had preserved even when exhaustion pressed at his chest. These threads extended beyond him, shaping quiet currents in ways that could ripple for years without anyone ever noticing the source. Summer often joined him, settling into the grass beside him without words, sharing in the stillness. Their silences spoke volumes of understanding, of trust, of the unspoken knowledge that gentleness mattered, even if no one else recognized it. Rick, meanwhile, continued his mutterings and mechanical chaos, yet Morty noticed subtler gestures, tools left ready, instructions given with less frustration, the faintest nod of acknowledgement when Morty navigated a complex problem without guidance. Even without explicit recognition, Morty could feel the patterns of care reflecting back to him, reinforcing what he had always known. That influence is strongest when it flows quietly, without demand or spectacle. Memories rose with more clarity now, looping through his mind with gentle persistence. He remembered the shadow that had once loomed at the edges of his dreams, the version of himself hollowed by indifference, waiting for him to falter. He remembered the first moments of uncertainty, when even basic acts of presence felt burdensome. He recalled the small victories, the nods, the smiles, the unspoken acknowledgements that had strengthened his resolve. Every memory stitched itself together, forming a tapestry of growth, resilience, and quiet triumph that he could carry without effort. As Morty lay back on the grass, gazing at the constellations, he allowed himself to feel the full weight and breadth of his journey. The vow he had made long ago, to remain soft, to remain present, to care even when it hurt, had become a living force. It had extended into his family, his friends, even the strangers whose paths he crossed briefly. It had not only endured the shadow, but it had begun to shape the spaces around him, bending them gently toward attentiveness, patience, and care. In that realization, Morty exhaled, deeply and slowly, feeling the tension of years dissolve into quiet peace. He understood now that his journey was not measured in battles won or lost, but in the ripples of subtle influence that reached further than he could ever see. The shadow, the doubts, the weight, they had all been part of this slow shaping, this persistent bending of life towards something softer, steadier, enduring. And in the gentle hush of the night, Morty finally allowed himself to relax completely, trusting that the patterns he had set in motion would continue, quietly, even beyond his immediate presence. The nights had grown almost sacred to Morty. Beneath the vast, quiet sky, he could feel the full extent of what he had carried and what he had allowed to unfold. The shadows of doubt that had once pressed close now lingered only faintly, like distant hills at twilight. He thought of the first time he had noticed the ripple of his quiet presence, the hesitating smile of a classmate, the soft acknowledgement in Summer's gaze, the subtle nod from Rick, and he realized that the smallest choices had been the ones that mattered most. Each moment of attentiveness, each act of patience, each refusal to harden had grown into a network of influence he could not fully see, yet felt in every pulse of life around him. He walked slowly through the yard, hands brushing the grass, listening to the faint chorus of nocturnal life. Each sound carried a new resonance, the wind through the leaves, the distant hum of the streets, the subtle creak of the porch beneath him. It was as if the world itself had learned to breathe more gently, shaped by the threads of care he had woven into it. He did not think of it as achievement or success. It was not loud. It was a quiet presence, persistent, enduring, subtle, and profoundly alive. Summer sat beside him, leaning back with her arms crossed and her gaze on the stars. She did not speak. Morty did not either. They shared the silence, feeling its weight and its comfort. Rick moved in the background, tinkering with another invention, muttering, the familiar hum of machines filling the air. Yet even Rick seemed different now, not in grand declarations, not in overt gestures, but in small acknowledgements, subtle adjustments that reflected Morty's steady influence on the household rhythm. Morty thought of the shadow, the hollow version of himself that had once haunted dreams and reflections. It no longer felt pressing. It had served its purpose, testing him, reminding him of the stakes, sharpening his vow to remain soft and present. Now, he could see clearly that the vow was more than defense. It was creation. It had shaped him, yes, but it had also shaped the people and spaces around him, gently bending them toward care and attention. The legacy he had built was quiet, subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniably alive in every thoughtful pause, every shared silence, every small act of kindness that now threaded through the world. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension of years settle into the quiet night. Memories looped gently through his mind, the first moments of uncertainty, the long stretches of doubt, the encounters with shadow and reflection, the ripples in Rick, Summer, and the others, the subtle ways the world had begun to bend toward gentleness. It was a tapestry, fragile yet enduring, built not in grand gestures, but in the persistence of quiet care. Morty lay back on the grass, eyes tracing the patterns of stars, feeling a calm that had been earned through every act of attentiveness and patience he had cultivated. The universe stretched endlessly above him, and in the hush of night, he understood fully that his journey was not measured in battles, victories, or recognition, but in the quiet, persistent shaping of life around him, in the legacy of presence and gentleness that would endure long after the moment passed. He whispered softly to the stars, to the night, to himself. The sky had grown softer now, a deep indigo bleeding into the faintest hints of dawn. Morty remained lying on the grass, letting the chill of night brush his skin and the distant hum of the world settle. Around him, he realized that the quiet he had cultivated was no longer fragile. It had thickened into something tangible, almost a presence of its own. Every small act of care, every attentive pause, every moment he had chosen to remain gentle had coalesced into a resonance that stretched far beyond the edges of his immediate world. The ripple he had set in motion had become a current, subtle yet persistent, carrying with it the essence of his vow. Summer had fallen asleep beside him at some point, her breathing even, her presence steady. Rick's machinery hummed faintly in the background, the clatter of experiments now softened into a constant, reassuring rhythm. Morty thought about the shadow again, not with fear, but with gratitude. It had tested him, forced him to measure the limits of patience, resilience, and softness. Without it, he might never have understood the depth of his own persistence, the quiet power in choosing gentleness even when nothing seemed to reward it. He rose slowly, brushing grass from his sleeves, and walked toward the house. Each step felt measured, deliberate, a mirror of the inner steadiness he had been practicing for so long. Even the world seemed to bend subtly in response. Neighbors moved with gentler steps, children played with small attentiveness, and the faint patterns of connection he had begun to seed now appeared in places he had never imagined reaching. Morty understood now that influence did not need to be dramatic or loud. It was the quiet insistence of presence, the subtle shaping of spaces and hearts over time that endured. In the quiet of his room later that morning, Morty reflected on the loops of memory that had guided him to this point. The early fears, the moments of awkwardness, the nights haunted by shadows, all of it had built the foundation of a legacy far more enduring than any triumph he could have imagined. Each encounter, each act of softness, had left a trace, forming patterns that moved through others in ways he could see only faintly, but feel fully. The world had begun to carry his quiet influence, stretching beyond him, even while he remained himself, present, soft, and attentive. He finally leaned back against the wall, eyes closing, and allowed himself to sink into the calm. The hum of life, the soft murmur of distant voices, the steady rhythm of Rick's machines, Summer's slow breathing, it all folded around him, a testament to the enduring quiet he had nurtured. Morty knew now that his story was not about battles, not about recognition, not even about the shadows he had faced. It was about persistence, about the gentle shaping of life itself, about leaving spaces in the world where softness could survive and even thrive. And as the morning light began to touch the edges of the room, Morty whispered to himself, to the sky, to the stillness that surrounded him. Even as the morning light seeped through the blinds, Morty didn't rise immediately. He stayed there, letting the warmth of the sun touch his face, the quiet hum of life outside the window filtering into the room. Everything felt connected now, subtle threads weaving through space and time, linking moments, people, and choices in patterns he could feel but not fully see. The quiet influence he had nurtured over years had grown, not in spectacle, but in the resonance it left in every small gesture, every attentive glance, every act of soft patience that moved outward like ripples in a pond. Summer stirred nearby, still half asleep, and Morty watched her for a moment, noting the gentle curve of her breathing, the way she had begun to lean into spaces without rushing, reflecting the steadiness he had carried for so long. Rick's lab continued its low hum from the garage, but Morty barely noticed it now. Even the chaos felt tempered, a mirror of the calm persistence he had practiced in his own life. It was proof that influence, once anchored in consistency and care, could extend far beyond intention, touching even those who had not yet realized its presence. He thought again of the shadow, the hollow version of himself that had haunted dreams and reflections. It had been a test, a warning, a mirror, and yet it now seemed more like a teacher than a threat. Morty understood that gentleness was not merely resistance to darkness. It was creation, shaping spaces and people subtly, irrevocably over time. Every act of patience, every attentive pause, every moment he chose softness had left a mark, and those marks now intertwined with the world in ways he could barely trace. Walking through the house, he saw evidence in small, unspoken ways. Summer lingering longer in the kitchen while she helped, Rick leaving a tool exactly where it would be needed, a neighbor pausing in the yard to help someone unseen. Each instance was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet together they formed a network of presence and care that stretched far beyond what Morty could see. He realized that his vow, the choice to remain soft, present, and attentive, had become a living force, shaping life in subtle currents that no shadow could disrupt. At night, beneath the vastness of stars, Morty reflected on all of it, the fears, the shadows, the small victories, the persistent choice to remain gentle. The ripples of his vow had grown into something enduring, touching not only his family and friends but the spaces between them, the paths of strangers, the cadence of ordinary life. He understood now that legacy was not built in moments of grandeur, but in persistent care, the quiet influence that extended farther than recognition, deeper than reward, and lasted longer than memory. Morty lay back in the grass, breathing in the soft night air, letting the hum of the universe settle around him. He whispered softly, a gentle exhale to the world, to the stars, to the ripple he had created. The world seemed quieter that night, though not in emptiness, more like a hush that carried weight and attention in equal measure. Morty lay on the grass, letting the cool night air curl around him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt fully present, fully aware of the quiet architecture of influence he had built. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The ripples he had sent outward, the soft patterns of gentleness and attentiveness, had begun to settle into the world itself. Every pause, every nod, every small act of care he had offered had grown roots, and those roots now extended beyond what he could see, touching lives, shaping moments, and creating space for softness to exist. Summer's breathing beside him was steady, a quiet rhythm that mirrored the calm Morty felt in his own chest. Rick, in the background, worked with his habitual muttering and mechanical clatter, yet even that had softened somehow, not in volume, but in cadence, a subtle acknowledgement of the presence Morty now carried effortlessly. Morty had long ago stopped expecting acknowledgement, yet it came anyway in these faint gestures, small and unspoken, but full of weight. He realized that the quiet influence he held was no longer confined to him. It had begun shaping the people around him without instruction or intention, as if the world itself had learned to pause, to notice, to care in the spaces where he had been steady. He thought of the shadow, of the hollow version of himself that had once lurked at the edges of perception. It had tested him, forced him to measure every moment of softness against the potential for fatigue or indifference. Now, in its absence, he understood that the shadow had done more than threaten. It had revealed what could endure, and what he had built could last. His vow, once a fragile promise, had become something more, a network of quiet resilience, a living force that could ripple outward and return, subtly reinforcing itself in ways that were imperceptible but profound. Walking slowly through the yard, Morty saw traces of it all in motion. A neighbour paused to let someone pass, unprompted, a small act of attention that mirrored his own quiet attentiveness. Children lingered longer in shared spaces, cooperating in ways that seemed instinctive, their behaviour shaped by the unseen rhythm of gentleness Morty had cultivated. Even Rick and Summer reflected it back to him, in pauses, in softened tones, in moments of patience that had not been there before. Morty realized that legacy wasn't defined by grandeur or spectacle, but by the persistent shaping of life, through small, careful, consistent acts of care. He lay back again beneath the sky, tracing the stars with his eyes and feeling the quiet hum of the universe fold around him. The shadow might linger in memory, but it could no longer touch him. He had built something enduring, something that would persist far beyond his immediate presence, a tapestry of gentleness, attentiveness, and quiet strength stitched into the rhythm of life itself. Morty whispered softly, letting the words drift upward into the night, into the infinite sky, into the world he had helped shape. The night stretched on, calm and unbroken, as Morty lay beneath the stars, feeling the weight of the world settle softly around him. There was no urgency, no pressing shadow at the edges, only the quiet hum of life, the subtle rhythm of existence that he had learned to listen to and inhabit. He thought of the journey that had led him here, the early fears, the nights haunted by reflections of hollow selves, the moments of doubt, the tests of his vow. Each memory now felt like a thread, woven into a tapestry that extended beyond himself, touching others in ways both visible and invisible. Summer's presence beside him was a quiet comfort, steady and unspoken. She did not need to say anything. The rhythm of her breathing, the soft rustle of her movement in the grass, carried meaning enough. Rick's lab, in the background, hummed with familiar life. The clatter of machinery softened into a constant, unobtrusive backdrop. Morty could feel the subtle changes in the world around him, small ripples of attentiveness, kindness, and patience, extending farther than he had ever imagined. The shadow that had once threatened to consume him lingered only as memory now, a distant echo that reminded him of the fragility of gentleness in a harsh universe. But Morty understood that it had done its work. It had tested him, shaped him, and prepared him for the quiet influence he now exerted over life around him. His vow to remain soft, present, and caring was no longer a private shield. It had become a living pattern reflected back to him through the people, the small gestures, and the unseen threads of connection he had nurtured. He rose slowly, brushing grass from his sleeves, and walked toward the house. The night air felt fuller, warmer, as if acknowledging the persistence he had carried. The neighbour's porch light glowed softly. The distant sounds of human life carried a gentle cadence, and Morty realized that even in his absence, the spaces he had touched would remember the rhythm he had set. Influence, he understood now, was not about recognition or reward. It was about persistence, about quietly shaping the world through presence, attentiveness, and care. As he returned inside, Summer and Rick both observed him in small, subtle ways, reflecting the resonance of his steady influence. There were no grand declarations, no triumphant acknowledgments, only small, persistent signs that the world and the people within it were responding to the quiet architecture he had built. Morty allowed himself a small smile, recognizing that the journey was never about spectacle. It was about enduring, about creating space for gentleness, about leaving a legacy of presence that could ripple outward indefinitely. He sank back once more beneath the stars, letting the night envelope him completely, and whispered softly as if the universe itself were listening. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man." The night felt endless, yet perfectly still, as Morty lay back on the cool grass, letting the vast canopy of stars stretch above him. Each point of light shimmered faintly, a reminder of the vastness he could never fully touch but could sense in quiet understanding. He thought of every step that had brought him here, the early uncertainties, the shadows that lingered at the edges of his dreams, the persistent choice to remain soft, present, and attentive even when the world demanded hardness. All of it now felt part of a rhythm larger than himself, a subtle pattern weaving through the lives of those he loved, and even those he had never met. Summer, sleeping lightly beside him, stirred only once, a faint movement that reminded Morty of how far their shared path had come. Rick, somewhere in the dim glow of the garage, continued his tinkering, the low hum of machinery forming a gentle backdrop to the quiet of the night. Morty sensed the subtle echoes of his influence everywhere, in gestures of patience between classmates, in a neighbor's unexpected attentiveness, in the softening of voices and the gentle pauses in conversations that had once been rushed and indifferent. His presence, carried by small, consistent choices, had grown into a quiet current that extended far beyond his immediate sight. He thought again of the shadow, the hollow version of himself that had once tested and threatened him. Its presence now felt distant, like a memory of a storm long past. Morty understood that the shadow's purpose had been to teach him the value of endurance, the quiet power of softness, and the importance of staying present even when it seemed futile. In that understanding, he felt a deep calm, a certainty that the patterns he had established, however small they might seem, had taken root in the world, shaping spaces, moments, and hearts in ways he could feel but never fully measure. The night deepened, wrapping everything in a velvet hush. Morty allowed himself to exhale fully, the tension of years dissolving into the gentle rhythm of life around him. The vow he had carried, an insistence on gentleness, patience, and attentiveness, was no longer a burden or a solitary promise. It had grown into a quiet architecture of influence, extending into the lives of others, bending the world softly toward care, and persisting even where recognition never came. He closed his eyes, feeling the interconnected hum of life that stretched outward in infinite ripples, and whispered into the vast, listening night, "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."